Welcome everybody. Thank you to Alec for already solving the first of the evening's glitches. To Patricia Julian for composing our theme music, and everybody who has been donating and supporting this talk series and the Endangered Alphabets project in general. So this evening's talk is one that I have been so looking forward to. And the reason is that because I have no background as an artist, my mother was an artist, my daughters are artists, but I felt that it had skipped a generation. It meant that everything that I've been discovering about art has been by accident and also entirely new to me because I don't have like a degree in that kind of thing. And so what I'm going to do is take you through a series of discoveries and ideas that have occurred to me as I've been doing the Endangered Alphabets project. And of course, this is also great because at heart I'm an essayist, which means I love just kind of going in there and throwing an idea out and saying, isn't this an interesting idea? And then leaving the room and having no responsibility whatsoever for whether it's accurate or not, and just leaving it to sort of cause ferment in people's minds. So let's go back to 2009. And in fact, before I actually began carving endangered alphabets. So the first carving that I did was actually a series of signs, like shingles for family members one Christmas. And I certainly didn't think of that as art. What I did was I simply printed their name out and took it to Kinko's and blew it up until it was roughly the right size for the piece of wood, and then transferred the writing and then started carving it. And so, interestingly enough, I thought of that, if I thought of it at all, as copying. And straight away, that's kind of interesting because the way we are taught to write is by copying. In fact, there is this saying that is now really outdated, but you still hear it occasionally, where if someone made a mistake, you would say they blotted their copybook. And what that really meant was that as they were laboriously copying out the letters from the blackboard or the wall or whatever, with those horrible kind of metal-nibbed ink pens and inkwells, they would make a mistake. So straight away, there's kind of an interesting notion about whether writing is an act of copying or whether it's an act of expression. And we're going to come back to that one later. So at the time, though, I thought I was just, carving these signs as a Christmas present. By the time I did that, quite by chance, and it's a great story, by the way, and that story can be found in the first chapter of my book, Endangered Alphabets, highly recommended, and orderable from the endangeredalphabets.com website. I sort of stumbled into carving Chinese characters. So I still wasn't thinking of myself as an artist or really even as a woodcarver. I just knew that I was enjoying this. And so I went around to family members and said, choose a Chinese character that you think in some way represents you. And I will carve it for you and give it to you. And so the first thing I noticed about the difference between carving Chinese characters and the signs that I have been doing, and you have to bear in mind that I'm totally a beginner as a woodcarver, is that the Chinese characters were more forgiving. So if I'm carving a name that I've used a font to print out and I'm trying to carve it, it has these two parallel lines and I'm trying to carve between them. And if I go outside, then everything gets messed up and I have to make the whole letter fatter. And in Chinese, it was more forgiving. There was this swoop that you could do. You made a mistake, you could swoop larger. And obviously that's an idiotic perspective, but it meant that I had just started thinking, without realizing it, about the difference between writing as a human act and writing as a mechanical act. So I have a photograph here of one of those carvings. It's a terrible photograph, and it's not a good carving either. I have to remember this was really early days. But the other thing that was happening was that I was also thinking, you know, these characters look really nice on this curly maple because it sort of reminds me of silk. And so the painting on silk and the carving on the curly maple, again, I wasn't yet really thinking of myself as an artist or as even of these as artistic concepts. I just knew that this was actually fun. And this was for my daughter's boyfriend, whose name was Chad, but he was known as Pirate Chad. And that, I believe, at least I didn't know any Chinese, I was just looking this stuff up, was the character for pirate. And I kind of liked the fact that it looked like a pirate ship. So this is the level of stupidity that I'm entering, you know, this whole project in. So a very strange thing happened when I actually finished my first Endangered Alphabets carvings, which was a series of 13. Again, they were just copied. They were Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1. They were on omniglot.com. I printed them out, you know, blew them up to the right size, and I was just trying to copy them. And I did the exhibition, and people said to me, and this was a complete surprise, they said, "This is art." And I didn't really know what they meant. And so this evening's talk is really an answer to that question. What did they see that I hadn't seen? And what is it that makes someone say that something is art, and especially writing, if writing is such a functional and especially in our society, a mundane act. So all of this began to change when I met a guy called Mark Turin, who at the time was teaching at Yale, and he had a nonprofit called Digital Himalaya. And I really liked him, and I thought, I will do a carving of digital Himalaya that he can put up like in his office or something. And I'll do it in Nepalese. And what changed everything was the piece of wood that I used. So by then I had started getting friendly with the local wood shop, and Dave Wilson, who owned the local wood shop, said, look, I've got this piece of wood that's knocking around. It's no good to me. You know, it's yours if you want it. And you'll see in just a minute what that wood was like, not just yet. When I did this carving that said Digital Himalaya in Nepalese, and I painted it in gold paint, which seemed right. The thing that was amazing about it was the relationship between the words and the wood. The wood was utterly extraordinary. It was the grain was so turbulent that it actually was like, it reminded me of, in Paradise Lost, Milton's description of Satan's journey across hell. And hell is totally chaotic and turbulent. And, you know, he takes one pace forward and falls 1,000 feet or 1,000 miles, and then he's swept up. And the wood was like that. And I was so taken by this that after I'd done Mark's carving, I decided to do another carving with the other half of the same piece of wood. And here we have a really bad photograph of that. So as you can see, as I say, the grain is like all over the place. It's got these little planetoids in it. And what I had decided to carve in it, in Balinese, is the chant, Om and Shanti, Shanti and Om. And as I was doing this, it occurred to me that the looking at the writing and then looking at the wood, it was like the chant is an effort to bring stability to the chaos of the universe. That first of all, writing, by being a pattern, is a way to organize reality. And then secondly, the chant, which you say over and over again to center yourself, is also an effort to bring peace and stability to an unpredictable and chaotic world. So let's move on from that. It's very hard to understand what happens to wood when you put finish on it, unless you actually see it, and we can see it in just a second, because when you're carving the wood looks dry. It is dry. It looks dusty. After a while, I got to be where I could see what it would look like in the end, but it doesn't look like that to start with. And we've got a little bit of video coming up now to show what it looks like when you actually apply the finish to the wood. This is actually an adlam, as Craig knows, who's watching. Okay, so what happens is the wood takes on depth. It takes on dimensionality. And instead of being dry, all of a sudden it looks lush, it looks deep, the grain comes out. And what happens then, and this is the sort of the miracle of it all, is the writing seems to float above it. If you've ever been snorkeling in really clear water and you look down and you can't tell how deep the water is because everything is so clear, but you can see the features beneath it, that's what the writing looks like. It looks as if it's floating above the wood and the grain and the heart of the wood. And what this made me think about is the whole notion of order and pattern. And in fact, I began to develop what I think of as the Stonehenge theory. So we have a graphic here of Stonehenge, just in case you've never seen Stonehenge before. But this graphic is really important because it shows the people. So I can tell you what every single one of those people is doing. What they're doing is they are looking at these extraordinary constructions, and they're squinting this way and that, and they're lining them up with the sun, as you can see here. And then they're turning around and looking at the circle as a whole. And then they're looking across the valley to Silbury Hill, which is this extraordinary man-made mound about 1.5 miles away that's clearly part of this whole thing. And what they're doing is they are responding to an enigma. And the enigma is that just by looking at this, we can see there is intention. So pattern implies intention, and intention implies meaning, but we don't know what that meaning is. And the fascinating thing about that enigma is that we get captured by it, because we try and resolve the enigma by finding meaning. And until we found that meaning, we're troubled by it. It's like a question mark. A question mark is like a hook. It won't let you go. So, okay, that's enough of Stonehenge now, I think. So what I began realizing was that as humans, we are pattern-seeking and pattern-creating creatures. The way we stay safe is by being hyper-aware of any violations to the pattern. If there's a noise or a movement that we're not expecting, if something happens that is not as we predict, we are hardwired to pay attention to that right away. Equally, the way that we negotiate this potentially dangerous universe is by creating patterns, because patterns enable us to give predictability to each other, knowing that we are going to be looking for or listening for patterns, even in what we say or what we write to each other. And so speech is a kind of pattern, and writing is a kind of visual pattern. It's a way in which we instinctively create a methodology that not only allows us to communicate with each other, but to communicate with each other in an unthreatening way. And if we violate that pattern, so for example, if I were to suddenly scream at the top of my lungs, then we would notice that there would be too much of a variation in the pattern. Okay, so at this point then, I was starting to create this sort of unified theory of writing and wood that had something to do with art and meaning and pattern. And the other thing that I realized was that when you see that piece of Adlam writing, for example, on that piece of cherry, that pattern was created within the last, help me out here, Craig, 15 years, roughly speaking. The pattern in the wood was created by forces as old as the universe. That pattern, the ripple, the grain, is actually created by the stress on the wood, on the tree as it's growing. And in some cases, it may also be caused by a virus in the wood as well. And so water and light and wind are expressing themselves in that pattern. And the other thing that's fascinating and that's different between the pattern of the writing and the pattern of the wood is that the pattern of the wood is something that we recognize as a pattern, but in fact, it's not actually predictable. So if you think back to that first picture of the Chinese kanji of the pirate and the ripple of the curly maple, we say, oh, that's got a pattern, it's got this ripple pattern. But the fact is that even though we recognize it as a pattern, if I were to say, what exactly does the ripple do immediately beyond the photo, we couldn't tell. It's within a range of what we regard as patternhood, but it's unpredictable. And I put it to you that that combination of the predictable and the unpredictable is what we think of as beauty. So I'm gonna leave that idea kind of like mulling around and move on to a series of pictures now, sort of a slideshow. So once again, here we have this another lovely piece of curly maple. And here we have one of the Adinkra symbols from Ghana. This is Aya, the fern. And what is sort of fascinating about the Adinkra symbols is that they have 1 foot in the world of the graphic. This is clearly in some sense a stylized fern. But they also play with these graphics in fascinating ways, and they're intended to convey meaning. And of course, in this particular example, you've got the fronds or leaves or whatever they're called of a fern, and the ripple and the grain sort of talking to each other. And when people look at this, they say, yes, that's beautiful. And again, I always wonder, what exactly does that mean? But there's no doubt that it does something. Let's move on to the next one. So this is another Adinkra symbol. And so the Adinkra symbols do fascinating things with symmetry. So we saw the fern, okay, so that's more or less symmetrical along a vertical axis, but in fact it was bending slightly. And as such, it was like breaking the pattern. It was half a step, a few degrees into realism and into movement, which we'll come back to in a second. So this, as many of you know, is theoretically based on the hairstyle of a famous warrior. But the thing that I find fascinating about it is that it has this really interesting kind of S symmetry going on, and the curls emphasize that. And so it has this sense that it is moving all the time, even when it isn't. And again, the movement of the wood behind it suggests this is not a static endeavor. It's a pattern, but it's not a mathematical pattern. Okay, let's move on. This is another Adinkra symbol. This is the Siamese crocodiles. And again, it has a sort of a moral to it, or a point to it, which is, you know, if these two crocodiles are joined at the stomach, why would they be fighting over food? Because it's all going to wind up in the same place. So it's a symbol that stands for cooperation and collaboration. But again, look at the really interesting games that are going on with symmetry here. It's sort of symmetrical along the vertical axis. It's sort of not symmetrical, but it hints at symmetry along a horizontal axis. But the tails of the crocodiles also imply movement. So you've got something which is a stylized representation that might be crocodiles or baby crocodiles or lizards. So it has one foot in representational art, but it also has one foot in geometry, but it's not tied to its geometry. And again, like the wood, we know where it's going, but it's not as predictable as it might be. The next one. So this one is just so fascinating to me, because this is actually the Nsibidi symbol that, as far as we know, because Nsibidi is at least partly secret, means Nsibidi. But as soon as I saw this, I'm thinking, that is a perfect piece of 20th century abstract art, you know, mathematical art. That's like Mondrian. You have to ask yourself, how do you represent an idea? And one of the fascinating things about Nsibidi is that nobody knows, at least that I've found out, what those individual ingredients stand for, what the circle stands for. If that line that's down in the bottom right would mean the same thing if it was at a different angle, because it's intended to be communication between people who are within the same knowledge sphere. But what's fascinating also about that is that even if we were to say, yes, this is just a series of covert symbols that are known to everybody, nevertheless, it has an element of design, but also an element of movement to it. And so right now, for example, my collaborator, woodworker, and I are actually working on a clock that uses this symbol. And I think it's going to actually be deeply disturbing, because the clock movement and the lines in the Nsibidi symbol are by no means coherent. And I think that could be really, really could throw people off. Okay, what do we got next? Oh, got me again. Okay, good. So I'm going to read you a passage now from the Canadian / Sri Lanka writer Michael Ondaatje. Whoa, excuse me. That is my phone telling me that I should be doing something, and I'm going to ignore it. In Sri Lanka, as many of you know, they have two scripts that are used pretty broadly, one of which is Sinhala, for the Sinhalese language. And later, Michael Ondaatje, having left Sri Lanka and living in Canada, remembers learning to write. And again, so we're talking about copybook again. We're talking about copying, but instead of just rote copying, and trying to exactly imitate a model. This is how he writes. He says, the insect of ink curves into a shape that is almost sickle, spoon, eyelid. The letters are washed blunt glass which betray no jaggedness. Sanskrit was governed by verticals, but its sharp grid features were not possible, and so on. Here, the palm leaves which people wrote on were too brittle. A straight line would cut apart the leaf, and so a curling alphabet was derived from its Indian cousin. And then he just goes on to describe some of the letters. Moon coconut, the bones of a lover's spine. Years later, looking into a biology textbook, I came across a whole page depicting the small bones in the body and recognized, delighted, the shapes and forms of the first alphabet I ever copied from Kamaradaya's first grade reader. So in that sense, what he's saying is that writing becomes something more than a device for communication when we recognize in it, explicitly or implicitly, a human act. And so I want to talk about paper and calligraphy, and then we'll come back to this business of recognizing a human act. So I also want to talk about this theory I have about the physics of writing. So many of the early forms of writing, as far as we know, because obviously we don't know which ones haven't survived, were what I would call high energy systems. In other words, the effort that it took to incise a letter or to stamp a letter was sufficient that it didn't make sense to exert any more energy. So if, for example, you are scratching, say, runes, then many of the principal actions in runes are verticals, which makes perfect sense because that way you're using the weight of your body to make the act of writing less hard. And so then you have other branches moving away from those strong verticals. And so the idea of then joining one of them up to another one with a purely unnecessary ligature just didn't make sense in terms of physics. So about 2,000 years ago, the Chinese, who of course were deeply involved in the silk trade. Silk, as I'm sure you know, comes from silkworms. Silkworms, as I'm sure you know, live on mulberry trees. And mulberry trees have a very particular kind of bark. It's very bouncy. I'm not sure what the technical bark expert word would be. But what they discovered was that if they took the bark and they wetted it and they pounded it and rolled it, then they could make a writing surface, and this is really important, that was semi-absorbent. It wasn't totally absorbent, in which case if you put ink on it with a brush, it would just go zip. But equally, it wasn't like papyrus, which is a reed and doesn't absorb very well at all. And obviously bamboo doesn't absorb very well. So they had a semi-absorbent writing surface. And around the same time, ink and brush were also invented, probably not by coincidence. And so an interesting tipping point had happened in the history of writing, which was that for the first time, it actually took more energy to stop writing. So if you're writing with a brush and you finished a character and you take it off the page, take the brush off the page, you're actually using more energy to stop writing. And so not surprisingly, one of the things that developed very soon was the art of calligraphy. It makes very little sense to try and be expressive in a high energy physics system because you're putting so much energy just to convey meaning. As soon as you have paper and a brush, then you can have meaning and expressiveness. And so this, one of my theories is that writing is the most democratic art form because Okay, so in order for something to be an art form, it needs to have a certain universal quality, which can be which can affect everybody, but it also needs to have an individual degree of expressiveness. And writing, especially once you have writing with a tool that allows you to be expressive, has not only universal possibilities. So if I write an E, everybody else recognizes that an E, but it is so specific to us as individuals that not only is my E different from your E, but my E will be different at different times of the day when my energy is higher or lower, and even when I'm sick. And there's an entire science, graphology, devoted to being able to recognize the character of the individual in the execution of the letters. And so hence my theory, you know, writing is the most democratic art form because everybody does it pretty much, but they do it, we all do it in our own way. At least we did until we started doing a whole lot of thumb stuff on devices. The interesting thing also about calligraphy is that the Chinese kept the secret of paper making so secret that in fact you could be put to death for betraying the secret of paper making to anybody else, to an outsider. And the act of, or the science or whatever of paper making gradually spread along the Silk Road until, boy, someone's going to know this date and this fact better than I. It's in my book, but I can't remember it. So there was a major battle between Chinese forces and Arab forces. And I want to say it was near Samarkand, but I could be wrong. And according to legend, 2 Chinese papermakers were captured. And presumably they were tortured. And so the secret of paper passed over to the Arabs. And so it is no coincidence, I suggest, although I don't have the facts, that almost immediately afterwards, you get the development of the second great school of calligraphy, which is Arabic calligraphy. Obviously, it's a very different style of calligraphy, but again, it depends on having the medium that can be expressive. Whew. Okay, let me just check my notes here. Yes. Okay. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Alec? Right, so here are a couple of examples of calligraphy that I've carved. So this is Nushu, and Nushu really comes in 2 styles, one of which is more calligraphic than the other. And I'm looking at this, and one of the things that I absolutely love about this, and I began to realize this pretty early, is that the reason why Chinese calligraphy, which is frankly a little less clear here than in standard kanji calligraphy, but the reason why we think of it as beautiful is because you can see the act of writing. You can see where the brush hits the page and how it travels and how it lifts off, because you know the stroke fattens and then rises again. And obviously in standard Chinese, you really see this very clearly, where there's a kind of a splot where the brush hits the page, and that act, that movement of the wrist and the arm, it's the drama of writing. And when we see it, I believe that instinctively we see it as a human act, and we sort of feel that drama, even if we don't necessarily know the stroke order, for example, or how it's done. Next one. So this is calligraphy of a different kind. This is Tibetan calligraphy by the Buddhist monk Tashi Manox, whose calligraphy is absolutely extraordinary. And he does a variety of different Tibetan styles, because Tibetan has a variety of styles. And this one, he's obviously arranged in a circle, and this says graceful kindness. but it says it twice. And because it's circular, and because obviously you've got these repeated forms taking place, these diacritics, you know, around that thing, it means that essentially it becomes a kind of mantra because it repeats indefinitely, or a kind of mandala. And again, one of the reasons why this is so stunning, I think, is because it implies intention. Yes, it implies movement. It implies the movement of the hand and the movement of the script as a whole. And obviously it represents a kind of chant that goes over and over as well. Next slide, we see a completely different kind of writing as art. So this is the sort of hip-hop graffiti art of Christian Cabaway from the Philippines. And I believe he started out as a tattoo artist. So tattoos are really interesting because we want them to be art. And they are so totemic that in many cultures, the only way in which traditional writing survives is actually in tattooed images or characters or letters. And so he has taken this form much further. He now does performance art with it. He has a line of clothing. And here he's done it in sort of LA graffiti style, which is why I've painted it in this sort of silver paint with this sort of stripe in it to give it a third dimension. It seems to me, again, one of the reasons why this is so potent is because, again, we can see the drama of the act of writing, which in itself is a kind of expressiveness, but it's also a kind of gift. Writing is a gift from one person to another person or to everyone. Okay. I think we have one last slide, which we're going to look at in just a second. And I'm going to do sort of a wrap up here. I think I'm glad that I still don't understand exactly how all of this works. I'm sort of fascinated by the fact that we're at a time in history when an increasing number of writing systems are being drawn into the public pool, so to speak. I'm fascinated by the fact that people who are involved in digitizing have this really, really interesting challenge, which is how do we create a standard without losing the that life and individuality that makes writing something other than merely mechanical. That's an extraordinary challenge. And then being able to code it as well, my hat's off to all of those people. But equally, we're at a time when at the one end, we have the sort of the development of calligraphy or the expansion of calligraphy. At the other end, we have the mechanization of writing to the point where every letter or character really involves the same motion, which is a single keystroke. And so the notion of writing as a human act that uses the human wrist so we can recognize it is sort of being worked against by this desire for instant communication and a universality and the swiftness of communication. So I want to pull up this one last slide, which is really one of my favorite carvings that I've ever done. So some of you will recognize that this is the Cham E. And I don't know what makes this so compelling. It's something about the contrast between the wood in the background, which is doing one set of things and seems to be heading in one set of directions. And it's also something about that series of curves. You've really got 1, 2, 3 curves of the wrist in executing that letter. It's a pattern, but it's not symmetrical. It has these 3 or even 4 different tiers to it. it looks like, people say, oh, it looks like a pair of snakes, or it looks like smoke, or it looks like, you know, some kind of futuristic Italian modernist furniture from 1958. And it really, again, it's that enigma, that sense of the relationship between the necessity of communication and the possibility of expression that I think is what keeps writing in this fascinating position of being this universal art form that we all practice, whether we know it or not. So I'm going to wrap up now, but I'm going to do my slightly different version of my usual pitch. So I'm really hoping there's questions and comments and stuff coming in. But I also really want to say to you, if this has been interesting and worthwhile, and if this has been as interesting and worthwhile as, say, paying out a few bucks to go to the movies, I hope you'll consider supporting the Endangered Alphabets. And I hope you'll do so right now, because between now and July the 1st, thanks to money brought in by our own board, we're able to match donations, no matter how small, not quite no matter how big. We can't match if you're going to give us 10,000. That's the actual limit. But I don't believe anybody in this audience was actually reaching for a $10,000 bill at this moment. Anyhow, we have all this money waiting to be matched. It'd be great if you would take us up on that. So now, having done that, and by the way, at the end, Alec will show you a slide with our website, endangeredalphabets.com. You go there, there's a tab that says how to support us. That's where you go. But I am really looking forward to questions and comments. So please, please dive in, even if it's to say, I am full of it.
Well, I'll venture in with something. This is Craig Cornelius. I think we have a marvelous opportunity here in our technology to produce many fonts for every script in the world, and they can be used on most computers, laptops, and so on. But we also have a restriction on the ability to be expressive in these scripts, because mobile devices typically have 1 or 2 fonts only for each script. And that means that people will expect to see that one shape and may not recognize it if it differs from their traditional shapes. So we have the ability to have a wide variety and creativity, but we also have lost that with the device that most people will have readily at hand.
Great observation. And in fact, I was doing a talk for Wikitongues yesterday, and somebody brought up a very similar question. Is there a danger of limiting along the lines that Craig was just saying? And for those of you who don't know Craig, this is his work. He is one of the people going around the world connecting with minority language groups and helping them through that complex digitization process. And the answer that someone came up with yesterday, which I thought was really interesting, is the kids won't let us. So if you think about the early days of the availability of personal computers and laptops at home, they too came with a very narrow range of fonts. And the people who jumped on them and used them in ways that people didn't expect, and in case of like Comic Sans, you know, people didn't want, but they pushed the limit. So there is this a New Yorker cartoon that I've kept, that I've told this story before, and I apologize for repeating myself. So it ran in about 2007, and it's of an elementary school classroom. The kids are all sitting looking at the front, and there's the teacher, and there's a boy of about maybe 9, and he's holding these papers, And the teacher is looking down at him in a certain degree of bewilderment. And he's saying, before I read you my book report, I would like to discuss my font choice. And that's what's going to keep us human. It's that the kids are not going to want just one form, and they're going to mess with it. Okay, that's my belief, and that's my hope. Next question, next comment. Okay, I know you're not all asleep. I can see you.
I'll just mention that as you were talking, I couldn't help but let my nerdy side arise. And I think it would be fascinating if you talk to a fractal geometer about some of this sort of quasi-symmetry. And I think fractal geometry would have a lot to say about a lot of the artistic points you were making.
Ooh!
So if you ever want to nerd out,
we're going to get a Mandelbrot font.
yeah, exactly.
I love it. Olish, you were leaning forward as if you were about to say something.
Maybe let's make an exception. I'll not be saying that much. No, it's actually very interesting what you're saying, and art is always, with calligraphy for me, always the most important was actually the performance itself, because you're looking at it from the point of view of the tactile functions and how does it feel, the material and everything. And for me, it is more like a performative function, the calligraphy itself. And I would like to say this is also an important part. Actually, writing without performance would lose part of it. We know only part. For me, for example, always the question to an Egyptologist was, how did they actually put the stroke order in those hieratic writing? And they say, oh, actually, they never researched it. They now struggling, which is interesting, because it's also important. And I would like to comment on what Craig said, if I may, is it's so inventive right now that you can include little bits of picture in the text. If you look at the Chinese net, that they can actually create their own bits of their own bits of gifs and everything in the text that are included, and gifs give you the possibility of having a performative value to your writing or to visual communication.
I can't believe it. Alec, we forgot the rabbit.
Alec, you forgot the rabbit.
This is, Olish, you are so right. There is something that I actually had set up, but it somehow didn't make it onto the shooting script. So Alec is unbelievably fast at pulling up memes and GIFs and stuff on his laptop. So I have every confidence that he's going to be able to pull this up. So this is actually a sona from the Chokwe people of Angola. And it's a beautiful illustration of exactly what you're saying, which is the relationship between writing and performance. So this is a form that does not exist without performance, or its meaning doesn't exist without performance. And I have actually carved one of these very reluctantly because the final product is not the thing. The performance, as you'll see, is the thing. And I can see Alec, who is moving at really high speed. And I'm vamping for you, mate. I'm vamping. I'm just playing the same 6 chords over and over again. Are we going to get it? Or am I? Yeah, okay, here we go. Here we go. We've got the nod. So if you haven't seen these, this is something that involves storytelling along with design. Okay, I'll shut up. So it begins with a series of dots that are made by the writer in sand, and he tells the story, and the story incorporates a journey around the universe of the dots. And then it goes here, there, never repeating itself. And you never know where it's going to go. And then bam, it has a message and it has a pattern and it's designed. So it's the only thing we have that we could compare it to would be like an animation. You know, you might do that in, you know, Adobe After Effects or something like that. But that is done using a fingertip in the sand as part of the education of a boy at puberty. And I love that. That is going like so far beyond our usual notions of what writing is. It just blows my mind every time I think about it. Okay, other questions or comments?
I may be about to expose my age here more than anything else, but we did do similar things in kindergarten, where there were stories based on pictures, which eventually the pictures told the stories in unexpected ways. I mean, this is not such a foreign concept, really.
So where was this in kindergarten?
In the U.S., in Arkansas.
In Arkansas. So this is like Arkansas sand drawings. We didn't even know about those. This is great.
Did you never draw a picture of a turkey from your hand? Did you never trace your hand? Or...
Oh, yes.
We had similar stories to those, but they were stories involving little characters who needed houses or such. You know, this is not such a foreign concept, really.
Huh. So yes, so you're right. So it's a combination of narrative storytelling and graphic art, and also performance, as Olish was saying. Thank you so much. I've obviously, you know, I follow you on Twitter, and I like all of your contributions there. I've been waiting for you to say something in one of these talks, and it was priceless. Great. Okay, we've got time for a couple more contributions here, I think.
There's a question there in the comments in the chat.
Okay. Let me pull it up. Okay. So you mentioned you get your data from the UDHR and the Omnidot data sets. Do you collect your own data as well? Absolutely. So yes, this morning I sent off to the publisher in London the first complete draft of the print edition of the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets. And I would never have got there without the help of a keen and sharp and knowledgeable team that's been working with me for the last few weeks. But yes, people are constantly sending me information and data. Did you know about this? Did you know about that? And also I'm doing a lot of research actually through Twitter and through Facebook groups. Really one of the most productive sort of forms of information, getting contact and stuff. So yeah, someone was saying to me yesterday, you know, that there is this sort of UNESCO list of the world's languages with their degrees of endangerment. And was there such a list for writing systems? And I said, I'm working on it. It's very hard to assess degree of endangerment, A, if there's only one person doing most of the work, and B, if the censuses that the countries carry out around the world don't include writing systems. They typically include language, but not scripts. And so to be able to say this number of people have reported using this script is something beyond our capabilities. And so therefore assessing the degree of threat or endangerment is sort of a judgment call. And so in the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets, I say these are the criteria that I use, but I cannot claim that they are exact. But yes, we are collecting our own data every single day. So Craig has also said Australian sand writing, also Parmese sand writing, Vanuatu sand writing. It's a fascinating genre in itself, and obviously it's also related to
And column.
column design. Yeah, exactly. Southern India. Yep. Boy, this is a great group. We're bringing so much together here. Okay, we've got time for one more question or comment.
Buy the book.
Craig, I love it. Thank you so much. And a comment from Ken Lundy, that wood pattern is also called fiddleback because there's obviously a tradition of using curly maple in violin making, especially in this country. All right. Thank you all so much. Next talk on Sunday is going to be creating and inventing scripts. So when I talk about endangered alphabets, really I'm talking about two things: traditional writing systems that have been marginalized, but also new or recent writing systems that have been created for a particular culture or language group that are sort of struggling to find their feet and to find a user group. And that's what we're going to be looking at next time. And I hope to see you all then. Bring your friends. All right. Take care. And there is the donation information. Don't forget, your donation will be matched.